Since 2012, Bram has been one of the senior editors of the open access journal Conservation and Society. Next, our second speaker is Dr. Robert Fletcher. He is an environmental anthropologist with research interests in conservation, development, ecotourism, globalization, climate change, social and resistance movements, and non-state forms of governance. He uses a political ecology approach to explore how culturally specific understandings of human non-human relations and political economic structures intersect to inform patterns of natural resource use and conflict. He has conducted research in Latin America, particularly in Costa Rica and Chile, and has begun to work in East Africa as well. He is an associate professor at the Sociology of Development and Change Group of Wageningen University, also in the Netherlands. And Bram and Rob are also the authors of the book, The Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene. Everyone, please join me in welcoming all the way from South Africa and the Netherlands, respectively, I believe, Dr. Bram Büscher and Dr. Robert Fletcher. Bram and Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jay, and to you and to Cynthia and everybody at the Philippine Biodiversity Society for this wonderful opportunity, and also just to all the participants for joining. This is a real honor for both of us. We're very excited to be able to present some of our ideas here, but also especially to have the discussion afterwards. So we'll try to keep it within the 45 minutes. And then very much look forward to the discussion. I will kick us off, and then Rob will do the second half of the talk. So maybe if we can get to the PowerPoint slides. There we go. So the title speaks for itself, right? In case it wasn't clear already, we need a conservation revolution, a call and a proposal for a convivial alternative, and we'll try to do both these different sides of the title. On the one hand, to make clear that we do need a change in how we think about and practice conservation, and then try to outline some ideas for a convivial conservation alternative. But before I start, let's go to the next slide. I want to show you what I looked like 20 years ago. As you can see, I've gotten a little bit older, and I'm not going to say wiser or any of those kind of things, but it's been a long time since I was literally 20 years ago in Cebu City in the Philippines, as you can see on this picture, with a friend from the Netherlands and a friend from the Philippines, and our wonderful office leader, Mam Nina, that brings me even more pleasure to be speaking to you all today, because unfortunately I have not yet been back to the Philippines, but I really long to do so, hopefully before too long. So I also really want to learn from you, what has changed over the last 20 years. But if we go to the next slide, I've done a little bit of reading up in terms of biodiversity, at least. It seems there are some challenges, right, in the Philippines as they are globally. So I don't know if we can go to the next slide. But what I read in the news, at least from the Natural History Museum and its research, is that there are some alarming trends in relation to biodiversity loss in the Philippines until 2050, and that it will still take quite a bit of work, right? By many actors, and I think the Philippine Biodiversity Society, of course, is very, very central in that, to sort of bend the curve and come back up to a more positive relation between people and biodiversity. But clearly, I mean, the Philippines is not alone, right? I mean, this is a global problem, but takes very different shapes in different parts of the world. So if we go to the next slide, then all of this is very familiar to everybody. Just maybe press another time. Here you see literally the last 5 Living Planet reports of the of WWF. Please press. And its main conclusion is that our relationship with biodiversity, with the rest of nature, is basically broken. Can you go forward? One more? Yes, and one more, please. There we go. So, I can go into much detail, but I think their main conclusion, right, is very clear. Our relationship with nature is broken in many ways, and this comes on top of the IPBES assessment from 2019, which already concluded the same. Next one, please. So please press again. Yeah, there we go. So why we titled it "In Case It Wasn't Clear Already" is that we've seen stronger and stronger warnings, right? So this is one of them, the scientists' warning, and next one, if you press again, there's another one, right, whereby some scientists actually start talking about biological annihilation via the ongoing 6th mass extinction. And then one more, please. And so this here shows, right, another slide. I'm not going to go into any detail, but another title that clearly sort of outlines the scale of the challenge, right? Underestimating the challenges of avoiding a ghastly future. So next, please. So a lot of this has been going out, and I don't know the exact, how we should see this in the Philippines. Obviously, because biodiversity dynamics are never linear, right? They're never straightforward. They go up and down in different, also in the time that we live in. But overall, what we see is that rhetoric and warnings around biodiversity loss are getting stronger and stronger, right? So next 2 clicks, please. And that in that sense, we know that business as usual is not sustainable. I think this is not a strong statement to make, right? I think we all would agree on that. But one extra step that we have been making in our work, so Rob and I both together, but also with a lot of colleagues from around the world, have been studying conservation and conservationists actually for 20 years. And we've come to the conclusion, at least, that mainstream conservation is no antidote to this. And that actually we need to rethink conservation itself. Next one, please. Now, why is that the case? So you can't read the small letters here, and please don't even try. But this is a slide that shows you studies from the from sort of Anthropocene debates on what they call the Great Acceleration, which means very simply that across many socio-economic trends like tourism, soil depletion, but also earth system trends like CO2, but even shrimp, aquaculture, etc., very different types of earth system trends. We see the same type of graph and the same type of way in which it accelerates, right? The so-called hockey stick graph. And literally what this is supposed to show is that the trajectory that we are in globally cannot be sustained, right? If these things grow in the way that they have done over the last 100 to 200 years, clearly it will put so much pressure on biodiversity, on the living ecosystem, that it's very clearly not sustainable. Next. But if we look at the success of conservation, right? So conservation has to some degree been quite successful, particularly in one of its main tools in the toolbox, namely protected areas. What we see is actually the same type of graph. So we also see from the 1970s especially a strong acceleration of the total land area in the world under some form of protection, both terrestrial, which is the green, and the blue, which is marine, and then the total line is the red line. So it's actually a tenfold, literally a tenfold in the total amount of land or marine areas under a formal mode of protection. So actually you can say that conservation has been quite successful. But if we go to the next slide, obviously we also know that at the same time, right, we've come to the 6th extinction crisis. So as we've seen the success of conservation, right? We've also come into the sixth extinction crisis and more dire warnings. And that's why we feel, in case it wasn't clear already, that we need a conservation revolution. So how do we see that? Next slide, please. So what we've done in our book is to reflect on debates in conservation in relation to, and please press another 2 times or 3 times actually. What we've seen in the conservation sector, globally at least, but of course, again, this may be quite different in the Philippines, is that that these trends are, of course, heatedly discussed. And please, can you press 2 times or 3 times? There we go. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. That there are heated debates on all of this, and that is increasingly, an incredible sense of urgency, right? That literally the fate of life on Earth may be at stake. And this is translating into all kinds of what we call Anthropocene conservation discussions. Anthropocene, of course, the era of the human and human sort of pressure on the rest of the planet. And it's translated more recently into the so-called 30 by 30 discussions, right? To try to protect 30% of global terrestrial biodiversity, land area important for biodiversity by 2030. So these are all part of the discussions going on right now. And what we've done in the book is to really look at 2 key systemic dimensions where we feel that the debate really comes together. And that's the relation between people and nature, and that is the relation between conservation and economic growth. So if you go to the next slide, please, and please click 4 times, then we can fill in the, thank you so much. Then we can fill in actually the basic intervention that we also want to make today. So for us, what is important really in the overall talk and the book is this slide. This really is sort of the central argument that we're making, and that we're going to work out in some slides after this, but of course not in the detail that we find in the book, but hopefully enough to trigger some discussions and maybe questions for afterwards. So very briefly, our understanding of the debate is along these 2 axes, right? The relation between people and nature on the horizontal side, and the relation between conservation and economic growth. If you look at historical conservation, what we call mainstream conservation, right? It's mainly focused on protected areas, so separating people and nature to some degree, right? And whether that worked out in practice is another matter, but that's the idea. And it didn't really confront mainstream economic growth. Now, over the last 10 years, we've seen some radical challenges to this. And 2 are noteworthy, we think, in particular. The new conservation trend, which really critiqued mainstream conservation from the inside out and saying, no, we need to take people into account. We need to go beyond protected areas, and we need to really connect people to biodiversity. So this is a really, but they wanted to do so specifically within mainstream economic growth. Opposite of that, we have sort of the 30 by 30 trend, but also half Earth and those kind of communities that actually sort of say, no, we need to go back to protected areas, make that bigger, right, to 30 by 30 or 50 by 50. But they're also, some of them, not all, becoming critical of economic growth. We actually think that these discussions in conservation are really important because they actually point to the key issues we need to be talking about, and actually are making steps to where we feel we need to go. Except that both of them, and I will lay that out very briefly in a moment, do one of the 2 things and not the other. So we actually say, no, you need to go beyond separating nature and people and beyond economic growth at the same time if we want to go to a sustainable planet. And that is what we call convivial conservation. So this, in very brief, is also the outline of our talk. I will very briefly go through these first three, just as an overview, and then Rob will say a lot more about our ideas about convivial conservation. So next, please. All right, please click until the slide is full. I think 2 times, if I'm correct. That's it, yes. Very briefly, so we just wanted to state that mainstream conservation is a very, very broad church, right? And it will be interesting to hear from, from Jay, Cynthia, and other colleagues online to see how colleagues in the Philippines actually relate to this. But we build on other literature that actually defines mainstream conservation as a particular historical and institutional strain of Western conservation, practiced and promoted especially by large, powerful international conservation organizations and agencies, who have mainly, again, come, emerged in the West, like WWF, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, etc. Important also is that their relation with, elite interests and big business or prominent business interests is not something new over the last 20, 30 years, although now we've heard much about it, of course, but it's actually been there right from the start. The only thing that we argue in the book is that this relationship between conservation and business is actually intensified tremendously over the last decade, right? And that we've seen things like the Business and Biodiversity Initiative, Nature Fest, but especially more prominently the Natural Capital Coalition and others. And they're actually a logical step in this process. Next, please. So mainstream conservation has received these 2 challenges, as I mentioned before. Please, another couple of clicks. I think 4, yeah, that's it, thank you. The one is new conservation, as I mentioned before. These are their most important arguments, right? They say that the focus on protected areas, can save some biodiversity, but it has not stopped overall biodiversity loss. And I showed that before as well. Their second argument is that conservation has actually been working against the poor and must take development issues much more seriously. But in order to do that, it must also drop what they call unrealistic myths of wilderness and pristine nature, right? In general, but especially in the time that we live in now, in the Anthropocene. And so their answer is that humans must take their dominance of the earth seriously and manage the earth as a garden and cultivate what Fred Pierce calls the new wild. So here are some books and some people that have really been at the forefront of this, but there are many, many more. Next slide. So what they propose is to go beyond the nature-people dichotomy and actually work literally, and they say that literally, this is a quote from one of their articles, to work with and not against capitalism. So they literally state that conservation should seek to support and inform the right kinds of development, done with the importance of nature to thriving economies in mind. Instead of scolding capitalists, actually conservationists should partner with corporations in a science-based effort to integrate the value of nature's benefits into their operations and cultures, right? So this is very much in that particular quadrant that I showed in our central figure. So this has gotten a lot of critique. And if we go to the next slide, we see the critique from the neo-protectionists. They are very critical of all this because they believe that wilderness and nature, right, are real categories. They should be as autonomous from people as possible. And that rather to embrace this idea that we should manage the earth as a garden, we should be very cautious. We should actually, rein in the excesses that we see today. But perhaps their most important argument is to accept limits and boundaries, to accept limits to where people can live and develop. They're also very much about population growth, right? An issue I would assume is also, prominent within conservation debates in the Philippines. And to put boundaries to consumption and economic growth. So they are, very different from those new conservation debates. So what are their suggestions? If we go to the next slide, you will see what they propose. they propose to get back to the core agenda that we know, namely that only within parks and protected areas will many large animals critical to ecological processes persist, and hence the global strategy for conservation must be to expand the number and size of protected areas, interconnect them, and rewild them. Right? So either through the idea of nature needs half or half Earth, that was championed by Edward O. Wilson, and that has more recently morphed into the 30 by 30 campaign that I'm sure is also very familiar in the Philippines, amongst others, supported by the WISE campaign for nature. So this is very recent, and we'll see in maybe half a year in China, of course, what will happen to this agenda. All right, so how to make sense of this? For the next slide, please. So what we say in the book is that the Anthropocene conservation debates are important debates that have been going on within conservation, but also quite hectic debates, right? And so we can ask the question, is this healthy or a healthy debate, or is this really infighting? And some people on the inside actually believe that this is much more about infighting, that different conservationists, fight with each other, because they have very different ideas about how conservation is done. And I really can't wait to actually hear from you, from Jay, from Cynthia, from people online, to hear how you think about this, right? In the Philippines, what are the key elements in the big debates on conservation in the Philippines at the moment, right? So this is much more a global picture, but it may be very different. How we relate to that debate is that we say that the stakes are very high, right? And that the lived reality of the conservation community is often very tense and pressured. That a lot of conservationists feel a great sense of urgency and responsibility, and that we also, social scientists, who may sometimes be critical of conservation, need to take this very seriously, right? We also believe we have an urgent and serious problems on our hand, and that we must have a nuanced discussion of these issues going forward. And that is how we also present our proposal. And I will give the floor to Rob to take it from here.
Great, thanks, Bram. Can you please forward to the next slide? And put up all the text. All right. So we spent about the first half of the book evaluating these different perspectives that we've seen emerging, both in terms of mainstream conservation positions, but also these ostensibly kind of radical positions that have arisen to critique them. And what we argue is that while it's important that this critique arises and how it really signals the urgency of the situation that we're in, that it doesn't really go far enough. Okay? But what they do is really signal the need to go further than these positions to argue for something even more radical, right? Something that takes seriously the need to get beyond the type of separation between humans and nature that's been characteristic of protected areas as the main form of conservation planning, but also that goes beyond market mechanisms and the attempt to harness economic growth as the basis of conservation moving forward, right? So we argue that these radical challenges presented by these other positions, the new conservationists and the neo-protectionists, are important, but they don't go further enough, and there's a need to go further. So please advance to the next slide. And can you please put up the text there? Yeah. All right, so what we argue is that while these different positions are addressing some of the symptoms of the biodiversity crisis, they don't really go to the root of things. Okay? They're both tightly connected to mainstream conservation, and while they challenge one component of the mainstream conservation position, they don't challenge it in total. And there's a need in particular to take political economy more seriously and to recognize that the main impact on biodiversity is a global politics and a global economy that's bent on incessant growth. Okay? One of the analogies we use is that right now conservation is often like trying to mop the floor while the tap is still on. And there's a need to actually address the causes of biodiversity loss rather than simply trying to stem the tide in the way that conservation often does. So can you please move forward to the next slide? All right, so our big question we asked then is, how do we do justice to these radical impulses contained in these other positions while also trying to move beyond them? And that's where our proposal for convivial conservation comes in. So what we try to do is imagine if we actually have a position that takes seriously all of the critiques that have been made of conservation's impact, both on biodiversity, but also on issues of social justice and human development. What would a position look like that takes these issues seriously and advances a conservation agenda in a more convivial direction? And what we try to do is then link up some very kind of large scale and long-term ideas for what a different conservation could look like, with some more concrete and immediate proposals for how to reform things in the here and now. With the idea that what we try to do over time then is to bring these things together, to keep in mind a more radical vision for how things could be reformed on a larger scale, with more practical and immediate reforms that can be done in the short term. So please move forward to the next slide. All right, so this is what we call the case for convivial conservation. There's a short video that we have attached to that, but in the interest of time, I think we will skip that for now. And if there's time at the end and interest, then we could potentially go back to it again. So let's move forward to the next slide. Again, we'll start getting into our more immediate proposals. All right, so the way we think of convivial conservation is what we call an intertwined strategy, right? Both beyond harnessing economic growth as a basis for conservation funding, and beyond trying to create spaces that strictly separate people and nature, okay? And this proposal, as we frame it, is deliberately not realistic, okay? Because our argument is that things that are realistic just fit within the current paradigm and don't really challenge things, right? So the point is to deliberately propose something that goes beyond the current limits of what we consider to be possible to try to push those limits. As Mackenzie Wark says, to open towards plural narratives about history could work out otherwise, right? And we want to fully acknowledge that many of the ideas that we present here are not our own. We're not reinventing the wheel, that we very much draw on many other proposals that are out there, many other things in development in all kinds of different ways within groups like the Indigenous and Community Conservation Areas Consortium and others that are advancing a lot of these same ideas. What we try to do is pull them all together into a coherent format that can kind of present a proposal to push back against some of these other proposals, the new conservationists and the neo-protectionists that we find important, but also problematic. So please advance again the slide. Please forward the slide. Good. All right, so in kind of the longer term and more of a global vision, we grant a proposal in 5 idealistic long-term propositions, some of which are more conceptual and some of which are more practical. So please advance to pull up the text that follows. All right. So the first idea we have is shifting conceptually from thinking about what we're trying to do, from creating protected areas to creating promoted areas, right? With the idea that the main thing that we're trying to protect nature from in creating protected areas is ourselves, right? And what this does is often create antagonistic relationships between conservationists and people living in the immediate area around protected areas, right? And so we see a need to reform this to create a different conceptual framing of what it is that conservation areas are intending to do, right? Not protect nature from people, but try to create more of a convivial space for interaction between humans and other species in a more sustainable and convivial way. The second long-term proposal that we have is to shift conceptually again from the idea that what we're doing is trying to save nature from humans to what we call celebrating both human and non-human nature, right? And first off, this involves the recognition that humans aren't opposed to nature, but are actually part of nature as well. And hence, any effective conservation would be both about acknowledging human needs for relationship with other species, right? Also acknowledging the needs of non-human species to be able to have their own space to thrive and grow, and to try to bring these two things into some type of more convivial equilibrium. So these are the two kind of more overarching conceptual switches that we advocate. And then this is grounded in 3 other more practical or concrete proposals for shifting as well. And the second is to think about how it is that we relate with conservation areas, and especially how we relate with tourism, which of course has been one of the main forms of financing and support for conservation areas all around the world, primarily through harnessing economic markets and growth. Okay? And particularly as we've seen in the COVID pandemic, this form of financing is very volatile, right? And a bit precarious, subject to economic fluctuations, issues of economic slowdown, restrictions on travel like we've seen, okay? And so we can recognize right now that it's precarious, but we can also recognize that what it does is create a very kind of ephemeral, short-term and fleeting relationships between people and the places they visit, with ecotourists often flitting around the world from one protected area to another to try to check different spaces off of their list. Okay? And so what we're advocating then is a shift from this, from what we call speedy touristic voyeurism, to more slower and long-term engaged visitation, more prominently focused on creating relationships between people who live in the immediate vicinity of conservation areas and the biodiversity contained within, but also then with travelers who invest in long-term relationships with conservation spaces, as opposed to flitting from one space to another very rapidly. Okay? And this also means shifting the focus from what we consider to be the form of nature that we present to ourselves and others. Okay? Recognizing that most often nature as depicted in nature documentaries, in ecotourism excursions and others, is very much focused on spectacles, right? On those types of interactions with large charismatic species involving lots of action in terms of interactions between different species, focused on hunting and that kind of thing. These large kind of spectacular forms of interaction. Okay? And then also thinking of nature as primarily something that exists outside of us, that is exotic in other spaces. And so we're advocating a shift from that into coming to appreciate more the mundane and everyday natures that exist all around us, the smaller spaces of nature in which we exist as well, to shift that focus from thinking of nature as something that's outside and external to us to something that's all around us and that we can relate with every day on a more regular basis. Okay? And then the final conceptual shift that we have is in terms of thinking about forms of governance, interaction, and participation. Okay? Often right now, our understanding of biodiversity and our ways of relating to it are formed on the basis of what we call privatized expert technocracy. Okay? So very much based on elite knowledge imposed in something of a top-down manner. And what we're advocating then is a shift from that to thinking of conservation governance as much more about democratic participation, especially grounded in centralizing local people who live in conservation areas as the main decision makers in terms of how we should relate to conservation spaces and the biodiversity contained within. All right, so these are kind of the 5 overarching long-term idealistic propositions that we first format. Okay, and then what we try to do is resolve this down into some more concrete proposals for what we can do in the shorter term as the basis for implementing a convivial conservation vision. And so this takes us to the next slide, please. And if you could please, then pull up the text. All right, so in terms of actually implementing convivial conservation in particular spaces, what we're envisioning is a redirection of how conservation is done, primarily along 3 different lines. Okay? In terms of how spaces are organized, landscapes are shaped, in terms of how conservation governance happens, and in terms of finance. Okay? So the first thing that we're advocating is moving beyond, again, creation of strict protected areas that try to separate humans from biodiversity, and instead focus on creating integrated conservation landscapes that do not strictly separate humans from other species. These kinds of spaces are already in existence in many parts of the world, especially in spaces managed by indigenous peoples and other local communities. The type of spaces organized within the Indigenous and Community Conservation Areas Consortium are very much indicative of this type of approach. Okay, so this isn't something that they're inventing or creating anew. This is something that is already happening all throughout the world, and is often the basis for a lot of organizations' proposals for how to kind of increase the space under conservation, and we're supporting this proposal of not necessarily eliminating conservation areas, reconceiving them as promoted areas as opposed to protected areas, but then complementing them with more integrated spaces in which humans and other species can learn to coexist respectfully. So the second main form of redirection is in terms of governance, right? And so again, we're promoting the idea of direct democratic governance as opposed to elite kind of top-down decision making. All right, so participation in a deep, kind of meaningful way of local people living in conservation spaces. Of course, these days, most conservation projects involve at least some lip service to participation, but often this is implemented in quite a superficial way, where local people become consultants, or where their inclusion is bought through the delivery of benefits, which are decided by outside conservationists. And so we see the need for a shift from this to very deeper and more direct relationships of governance involving local people as primary actors. And the third and equally significant shift is rethinking how it is that conservation is financed. Okay? And with talking with various conservationists over the years, many people recognize that this is one of their more significant challenges. So often people say, yes, we do have some success in creating integrated conservation landscapes. We're working on developing more directly democratic forms of governance. But what we find quite difficult is to develop alternative forms of finance that go beyond the market mechanisms, things like ecotourism, payment for environmental services, the REDD+ mechanism designed to harness economic markets as the basis for conservation finance, many of which are really not panning out in the ways that they were initially promised, and instead try to find other ways to develop a sustainable conservation finance. Yeah? And so we see this as very important. I need to develop forms of conservation funding that don't depend on economic growth and market engagement, and instead involve redistributing the wealth that we already have around us in ways that help support local community, human development, and then also biodiversity conservation simultaneously. Okay. And so then please advance to the next slide. All right. And so again, getting even more concrete and thinking about shifts in the political and economic terrain that can support these types of proposals that we've just presented, we're envisioning a set of more specific suggestions. Yeah. The first is to really focus on addressing what have often been identified as impacts on social justice of conservation that's come in the past, especially in terms of displacement of local people from areas that have been declared protected areas, right? Estimates are somewhere between 20 and 50 million people that have been displaced as a result of conservation areas and have been deprived then of access to the resources on which they depended, right? So really thinking about the need to address this in the form of what we call historic reparations, right? Acknowledging the past injustices and the deprivation of resources that many local people living in important conservation spaces have undergone. And to think of this as a part of an important process of decolonizing conservation spaces to really recognize the importance of racial, class, gender justice in conservation moving forward. Okay. And this leads us then to our second proposal, the idea of a conservation basic income, which we see as one of the main ways that historical reparations could be built into future conservation planning. So this is inspired by growing discussion of the idea of a universal basic income as a new form of economic support, right, for people and societies all around the world, that would shift from a creation of productive employment as a basis for development and shift more for redistribution of resources to people who don't have the ability to participate meaningfully in economic markets around them. Okay? So we're envisioning this is a monetary payment to individual community members living in and around conservation areas that allows them to lead a locally defined decent life. Okay? And we specifically distinguish this from the type of things that we see right now in terms of payment for environmental services and the Red Plus mechanism, which are very much conditional on local people acting in a particular way relative to resources. Okay? So as opposed to those kind of mechanisms, we're envisioning CBI not as a bribe, right, to incentivize communities not to use their resources in particular ways, but as an unconditional form of support that people can use in the ways that they choose to. Okay? And so what this we see this fundamentally doing is allowing people not to have to develop a relationship with the resources based on competition and extraction for engagement with global markets, and instead develop relationships of care with surrounding resources. So please advance to the next slide. And this is illustrated in this model right here. Right? So again, the idea of providing people with a basic income that allows them to not have to extract their local resources in unsustainable ways, instead develop more convivial relationships with resources as a result of not having this need to extract resources as the basis for survival. And please advance again. And please bring up the text. Okay. All right, so those are the first two more concrete policy proposals that we have. Okay. And the third is in terms of political engagement, especially between large conservation organizations and prominent corporations and businesses, as well as the states that found them. Okay. So right now, most of the large conservation organizations have been very busy in developing relationships with corporations and other large organizations with the explicit idea of trying to shift their practices away from unsustainable forms of resource use and in support of conservation. And while this has been important in terms of developing a conservation finding, we think the evidence suggests that this hasn't really worked very well in terms of shifting corporate strategies. Right? And we see as the need for a more kind of a stronger stance, a firmer stance in terms of how it is that conservationists relate with corporations. That basically, rather than trying to conceptualize natural resources as natural capital and demonstrate to corporations that they're unsustainably managing this natural capital, which we think is clear to most corporations because they can see this in their bottom line. This is the basis for the way profits are generated within conventional economies. We see a need for a stronger, more firmer stance that the only way we can directly engage with strong business interest is if they shift over to the more kind of convivial strategy and support redistributive mechanisms like conservation income more directly. Okay. And as the basis for this kind of political organization, this then brings us to our fourth and final, more concrete proposal, the idea of developing a convivial conservation coalition among different organizations that all share elements of these visions all around the world. Okay? And again, this is the kind of organization that is already happening, both among local groups and indigenous communities that are involved in conservation activities in different parts, as well as NGOs and other organizations that are supporting these, right? But as a basis of developing relationships among these various groups that can build into a coalition that's able to exert some significant political power in terms of influencing global policy discussions and hence shifting the terrain of discussion about the future of global biodiversity policy around the world, as well as the way in which organizations relate with corporations, national states, and other entities that have a significant impact on the biodiversity that we're trying to preserve. And so again, please shift to the next slide. We're almost finished here. All right. And so this brings us to the conclusions. Okay. We started out by making the case that at this point, it's increasingly difficult to acknowledge, to not acknowledge that we're in a significant moment here, right? Where despite quite some effort in terms of promoting conservation all around the world, especially over the last 50 years, the issues that we're confronting are getting worse, right? The development impacts that we're confronting are accelerating significantly, as well as the environmental impacts of this form of development. Okay? This is causing quite a crisis within and among conservation organizations, which has caused, inspired this range of, ostensibly radical proposals that we've discussed. Okay? We've argued that this is important. It really signals that there's a moment here, a potential for introducing a dramatic change in terms of how we pursue conservation in the future, but that the proposals that we've seen emerge from within the conservation community, while they do start to push the boundary and open space for the discussion that's needed, don't really push this discussion further as far as is really needed. Okay? And so what we see as crucially important for this is to take the importance of structural transformation seriously, right? The need to directly engage with the global political economy and the pressures it places on conservation spaces around us, okay? And so what we're talking about then is a need, both for reform of how conservation is done within specific spaces, but also moving beyond this to think about these pressures in a more systemic way, right? And to then, push for transformation of the global political economy and how, resources are used and engaged with in larger economic processes, to really focus away from just mopping up the floor while the tap is still running, and to think about how it is we can actually close the tap on these types of economic pressures. Okay. We don't have a chance to really get into this in detail right now, but we do have some more material about this if there's time in the course of question and answers after the talk. All right. But the way we have conceptualized our what we could call the theory of change is the need to very explicitly think of conservation as a political struggle. Okay, so it's not about just trying to promote consensus among different positions. The importance of taking a stand around a particular point of view and to promote that as the basis for political organization that can then provide a challenge and a pushback to some of these other positions that are doing a very effective job in creating their own forms of political organization. So thinking very explicitly about how to mobilize power in the interest of conservation. Right? And then, as we've already talked about, also thinking about time in relationship to conservation. And this is specifically in relation to our idea that what we need to do is simultaneously be promoting a long-term, more systemic vision for the type of world that we want to live in and how conservation fits within that, while at the same time also then trying to make immediate changes in the here and now on a local level as well as global level that can over time bring closer and closer what we're doing right now with our ideal vision of how things should act in the long run. And the third is in terms of dealing with different actors. Right? Often right now, conservation interventions focus very much on trying to change the behavior of people who are living on the ground in the immediate area around conservation spaces. But often these people have the least power to influence decision-making in these spaces, and also have the least impact on the biodiversity that they're living in association with. Okay? And we've seen a need to focus the shift of conservation interventions away from this and towards the people who are actually influencing most the economic processes that impact biodiversity through their production and consumption, okay? Whether or not they live close to conservation areas. So shifting that focus away from trying to change the behavior of local people living near conservation spaces and trying to change, basically the people who are running the gears of the global economy most, even if they don't live close to conservation spaces, and tracing the impacts from their activities to the conservation that we're trying to enact. And so then in conclusion, this leads us to the last point right here. Right? What we're arguing here is that it's time to reclaim the idea of what a conservation revolution would look like. Okay, many of these other positions that we've outlined claim to be pursuing a dramatic change in how conservation is done. But again, we have argued that we don't think that these changes have gone far enough. Okay, and we need is something that that pushes for more systemic and structural transformation, which is how we're conceptualizing revolution. Okay. So if you think of radical as something that the way we conceptualize in the book that goes to the roots of our crisis, this is what we're imagining a revolution, something that really directly addresses the root causes of the biodiversity impacts and then does the political and economic organization and calls for the type of transformation that's really needed to address these impacts on a larger scale. Okay. How this actually plays out in concrete spaces and political organization needs to be worked out within these spaces. And so as we wrap up this talk, then we're very interested to see how these ideas might resonate with the work that you're doing out there, and how we can then get into dialogue about how to move these discussions forward to address the biodiversity challenges that we're all seriously confronting right now. So thanks so much for allowing this space for us to present some of these ideas, and we look forward to discussing them more with you in the remaining time we have.
Thank you very much, Bram and Rob. Well, there's definitely a lot to unpack there. So I'm sure our audience has lots of questions and comments. We already have a few. Let's run through some of them first. And so the first one we have here is from David Justin Pless. He asks, how do we reconcile the desire for shared spaces between people and other organisms and the possibility for zoonotic disease transfer that often happens due to habitat encroachment? Any one of you can answer?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for us, this actually comes back to the key pressures that we are seeing from the economy now that have actually led to the corona crisis that we're in, and the potential for other zoonotic diseases, right? I think it is a fallacy to imagine that if you actually argue for the integration of people and biodiversity, right, to have closer relations, that means an intensification of those relationships. It means a different way of relating people and nature, right, away from the intensification that we see now, right? So what you could see the current economic system doing is really intensify pressures on the planet, right, on people. I mean, I'm sure all of you feel the same pressures and tensions that we also feel, but in a very different context and history in the Philippines. But still, you know, in order to produce papers, in order to do your research, in order to deal with institutional, I mean, the pressures on life more generally, but also biodiversity, have become bigger and bigger. And that actually leads much more to the threat of zoonotic diseases than what we propose, which is the opposite of intensification, which is actually creating more space to develop different forms of relations with the non-human world that, you know, in certain places will have close interactions like there have always been, but in other places there will actually be much more space for, you know, for more extensive or expansive with an A relationships, right, whereby we leave alone, you know, those animals and those, you know, creatures that actually, and ecosystems that also need their own space, right? So I actually think that the chances for zoonotic transmission will be less in our idea of convivial conservation rather than more.
Thank you, Bram. Do you have anything to add, Rob?
Yeah, just to briefly echo that, I think you know, the evidence is quite clear that it's not just, you know, human encroachment on natural spaces in general that's responsible for the spread of zoonotic diseases. It's encroachment in a specific form, right? And it has to do with the expansion of, essentially monoculture, right? Large industrial agricultural production, industrial livestock production. That's the primary issue that we have to confront. And so what we're then suggesting then is an economy that moves away from that type of production altogether. And so hopefully then would have a diminished incidence of this type of transmission in the future, just as Bram suggested.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move to another question from our audience from Edward Perez Belen. Hi, good afternoon. Really glad that we are talking about this. Is the problem with fortress conservation inherent, that it is not effective in itself? Or is it that it has the tendency to be co-opted by capital and neoliberalism, that it would actually work out if not for these factors?
Yes, another really interesting question and point of discussion. There's a lot of issues with the fortress conservation, right? Both in terms of the practical issues of actually making it work, but also in terms of, we talked about the issues of social justice and human development, right? And so these are interrelated, but can be considered separately as well. I think for a long time, many conservationists have recognized that fortress conservation in and of itself doesn't really work for biodiversity, right? Because it creates a forest island. Hence, in these proposals from neo-protectionists, right, the talk is all about moving beyond protected areas to connect them and integrate them into much larger landscapes. So I think most people recognize that for biodiversity alone, fortress conservation is not really an effective strategy in the long run. Right? At the same time, it also has these human impacts, right? Most conservation spaces have been created by moving the people who used to work and live in these landscapes to other places. Okay? Oftentimes, this isn't obvious when conservation areas have been created because people were moved before the conservation areas were established, right? And so you have areas that appear to be unpeopled wilderness because their former populations were cleared from the spaces. This is true of most of the national parks in the U.S., in many other places as well. So you also have these social justice concerns, right? If protected areas haven't involved this kind of displacement, or the displacement has been compensated right now, and if there's opportunities through biological corridors and other places for conservation spaces to move between fortress conservation areas, then I guess, yeah, theoretically it's possible for these spaces to work, both for people and for biodiversity. But I think the evidence is mostly that these things aren't really happening, and there's a need to move away from this model.
Thank you, Rob. Bram, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, two things. I mean, so in a very strict sense, right? So if you're very strict about the fortress conservation, of course you can conserve biodiversity within, like a fortress wall, right? I mean, it will have the effects that Rob says. But what you're doing basically is creating little islands in a sea of unsustainability, right? That can certainly conserve some species, although there's also evidence around the world, as Rob mentioned, that, especially for those species that are very sensitive to more broader environmental changes, like amphibians or birds or others, that protected areas do not necessarily, always work in the ways that are foreseen, right? Because ultimately they are never fortresses in practice. So, it's really about the kind of world that we want to live in, and that is the critical broader issue, I would say. The second point is that if you look historically, protected areas have arisen within and due to the rise of capitalism, right? This is modern day protected areas are something very, very new. And they came up in a very specific time in the 19th century in specific places, right? And that model has been exported basically to the rest of the world, or exported, I should actually say, imposed on the rest of the world in many places, right? With huge social consequences. And so one of the key central theoretical points that we make is that you can't distinguish conservation from capitalism. They arose together, right? You could even almost say that without capitalism, there wouldn't be a need for conservation, right? Because conservation arose in response to the destruction of nature that capitalism actually brought. And so, right, fortress conservation should be seen in that model. And if we continue down that path, it will always be, exactly as Rob mentioned earlier, mopping the floor with the taps wide open, right? Trying to clean, the water from the floor, and the water is just running and running, right? And this is a key sort of strategy for conservation for the long term. Do you want to keep running, after the problem, right? Fighting this backroom fight to save little things here or there, or do you want to transformation to an actual sustainable world? And that is the key question confronting conservation communities today.
Thank you. That's very well put. I think that's also the case in the Philippines. The protected area system here has largely been due to the U.S. influence during our time as they're called. Let's go to another question. We have lots so far. From an anonymous attendee, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Do you observe any positive changes or examples in the business dimension of things in terms of moving towards the goals of convivial conservation? Or is the situation continuing to get worse?
I think there are some positive examples, right? I mean, there's so much more discussion of sustainability and the attempt to assess negative environmental impacts and to try to transform these into positive impacts among businesses all around the world, right? And we do have lots of examples of businesses that really work hard to try to develop sustainably, right? And so we're not trying to be so cynical and thinking that that all of the shift in rhetoric that we've seen is just greenwashing, right? On the other hand, our point is that we can't rely on this alone, okay? Because businesses aren't free to operate how they choose, right? They're within a system that promotes competition and forces businesses, then to cater to the needs of shareholders, right? And then I can compete for value within these limited markets, right? And so if we just try to rely on businesses themselves or on promoting sustainability within businesses, then again, we're missing this larger kind of structural, systemic dimension that constrains this type of action, right? And it's very important for us that then we focus on that as well, right? There's a need to transform the fundamental economic system within which businesses operate, as opposed to simply promoting reform within particular businesses.
Thank you. Is it okay if we move to the next question?
I was just going to say, nothing to add to that.
Okay, thank you. So we have here from Ruben Gibb. So in the Philippines, we have the mother of all environmental laws that cover economic development. It's true. It's the Philippine Environmental Impacts Assessment Statement System. To comply with this law, among the mandated environmental impact assessments to be conducted includes studying different ecological parameter measurements for baseline studies on biodiversity. Can you share some innovative conservation ideas as to how the results of these kinds of biodiversity studies can be used to demonstratively show the reduction of project impact to residual level on biodiversity, so that we can use science, robust science, to establish some sense of balance between economic development and environmental conservation?
Well, that's a difficult question. I'm interested to learn more about the mother of all environmental laws. I mean, so I can't say about the Philippines, but in my experience here in South Africa, one of the key issues with environmental impact is that the ones proposing to change certain things in the landscape, or changing ecosystem, or having certain ecosystem impacts, are the ones that hire the environmental impact consultants, right? And so the environmental impact industry in South Africa has become dependent, for their livelihoods on the very companies that propose, the destruction of nature, right? So it's no wonder that 99% of, and there's been an interesting study on this, that 99% of all the environmental impact assessments in South Africa, I don't know elsewhere, but in South Africa, conclude that, these developments can go ahead, with some precautionary measures. But almost none of them say, no, it can't go ahead, because if they would say that, they would no longer be hired by the industry to do the very environmental impact assessment. So a key answer to that question, I would say, is an independent environmental impact assessment, right? Organized by an independent, either state or parastatal or maybe consortium, right, between, say, the state, the Philippine Biodiversity Society, and others, that can work independently on actually taking into account the different levels of impact that we see, right? Long-term, short-term, local, national. And those are the kind of things that I think is an absolute critical starting point to answer this question.
Thank you, Bram. So that's I think the key part there is the independence of the people doing the assessment from who's asking the assessment to be done. So in the case of the Philippines, that's a major problem, and I think there are efforts to reform our EIS system, but still has a long way to go, because it has caused the very a lot of developments to proceed without proper consideration of their impacts on biodiversity and the people in the areas where these developments are being done. Okay, so many other questions, but let's go to the next one. From Ma'am Leticia Afuang. Congratulations, Bram and Robert, for your mind-challenging presentation. Are there existing examples or cases where convivial conservation has been effectively applied? What are the practical approaches to make this work positively? And has its doability been actually analyzed, or is it another talk of full of thought but not fully loaded with data analysis support? Since there are already existing efforts to integrate the various factors affecting conservation, as you have also mentioned earlier, should we not just find a way to effectively bring together the usefulness of each factor? Overall, an effective and integrated education system that addresses all components of society, from child, youth, working adult to retiring adult, in all areas, from rural to urban, from the private sector to the government, and from the laborers, CEOs, and from individuals to multinationals, is a necessity for her. So, can you respond to that? Actually, there's another question also quite related to that, from EB Persben also, about beyond philosophizing about the radical changes. Do you know of any organizations or projects that have made good first steps towards this model that we are trying to achieve? Would love to know more about the works that you approve of. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I can start off a bit. There's a lot of different elements in there, but I'll try to address some of them. The first thing I want to say is that if what we're talking about was already in existence, already being promoted in place, and there really would be no need for us to have written this book or to be giving this talks, right? The point is that we're trying to kind of push beyond what is currently going on. As we mentioned, a lot of these ideas we have are inspired by things that are happening now. So we can say that a lot of the elements that we're talking about are at least being experimented with, and in some cases implemented in different places around the world. But as far as we know, nothing is really kind of bringing them together in the way that we're talking about as the basis for a kind of coherent platform and a coherent political perspective moving forward, right? So there are various places in which people are developing a successful cohabitation and coexistence strategies between humans and other species that we've drawn on. We've got a variety of different studies about that. There are some really good examples of effective conservation governance, based in very direct democratic organizations, and also then organization, across different spaces in these larger coalitions. Not as much evidence right now for the type of funding mechanisms that we're promoting, but that's something that we're working working on developing right now in terms of actually developing the basis for evidence-based evaluation of piloting of things like a conservation, a basic income. But the whole point is that these do need to be brought together in a coherent program, just as our interlocutor suggested. And this is exactly what we're promoting right now. And so we see conversations like this as the basis for making this happen. And we have conversations with a variety of different organizations, the ICCA Consortium, the Forest Peoples Program, other organizations that are Survival International, that are really working hard now to push the boundaries of how conservation is being done and can be done. And there's just a need to continue that those discussions and those pushback against the business as usual approach.
I'm just going to maybe add to that Rob would say that he actually leads a project, the Conviva project, which actually looks at the relation between predators and humans in 4 different countries, in Tanzania, the US, Finland, and Brazil. This was due to funding requirements from a donor, but Rob is actually leading this project to actually look at good examples of how to live with dangerous predators in a more convivial way. So we have lessons that we are drawing from that. And Rob, I think you are currently literally writing up also policy briefs on this, no?
Yeah, we're trying to pull this all together right now, but again, so we're pulling examples from different places, right? So we have a case study in Bulgaria where local people have figured out how to live with grizzly bears, essentially, in quite an interesting way. So there's examples from that. There's examples of people working to live with lions in Tanzania. But so different spaces emphasize different aspects of this. Some are working more on the governance aspect of things. Some are working more on the landscape aspect. There's integrative examples of finance, right? But no case that we have right now really pulls all of these different elements together into the type of coherent program that we're imagining.
Well, I mean, so this is actually what we're trying to do now in South Africa. So in South Africa, I am currently working. We have funding from one donor to actually build this more coherent program that Rob is talking about. So we are currently talking to a second donor to further. So basically, there are 3 main elements how we operationalize this. The center of it is a convivial conservation campaign to really change the way we think about conservation, to bring networks and actors together who are already starting to think differently, and to enable them to further these discussions and put pressure on mainstream conservation thinking. That's one. The other is on the ground landscape transformation, to study together with landscape architects, local people, economists, and others, to really study on the ground how transformation could happen in quite adverse historical circumstances. And then the third is also what Rob mentioned, the conservation basic income, to see if we can get a much bigger project going that allows the funding of people's time and livelihoods, so that they don't have to worry about intensifying, all kinds of growth things, etc. And then actually free people up to work together with these other actors in ideas about landscape transformation. So we're actually well on the way here in South Africa towards trying to start to come to bring these things together with donors. But if people online here and yourself, Jay, you have ideas about that in the Philippines, we would be very keen to work also with you guys to see if that will be possible, right? In a very, very different context.
Thank you for that. So okay, I think unfortunately we have so little time, so I think we can go through just a couple of questions. Well, let's go with these 2 semi-related ones. Paula Pagaduan asked, how do you see the transition from the current systems towards a convivial conservation model? And another question from an anonymous attendee, which sectors do you think could be the biggest driving forces for these kinds of changes that you envision? On the government, big conservation organizations, smaller NGOs, local NGOs, the academe, or others?
Yeah, those are very good questions. I think we actually take more of an intra-sectoral approach. I mean, we don't really see like you would have maybe in sort of standard Marxian or standard other that or standard neoliberal, where either the working class or business or the government needs to take the lead. I mean, one of the things we've done is to study how actual change works, and it works always across sectors. So what we want to do, and we have some money for that in South Africa, is to really bring actors together in different sectors and to help them push within these sectors to build a much more broader sort of, on the one hand, common understanding of what needs to change, and on the other hand, create more political pressures across these sectors. And then, of course, in the end, one or two sectors need to kind of flip, right? Need to kind of flip and really push more broadly for systemic change. This has happened in different circumstances, but we feel that the conservation sector can be really central in that, right? I mean, okay, let me put it very bluntly, right? The conservation sector can't keep saying, we're living in the sixth extinction crisis, right? Things are getting really, really bad, people. We need to change. And then keep on doing the same thing, right? Keep on doing the same thing in terms of protected areas and natural capital. Conservation organizations will not make themselves any more believable by doing, I think Einstein literally sort of said that the hallmark of stupidity is trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. No, conservation organizations really need to be one of the sectors pushing for change, right? So we really hope that in the Philippines, this can also happen, because that is critically important.
And another aspect, if I can just follow up quickly, is in terms of thinking about how it is this process of transition actually happens. One of our main models for this is actually how neoliberalism, became such a dominant way of organizing in our world from having been a very marginal idea, after the World War II, that was regarded very suspiciously by many, right? And then the person who really theorized and then promoted that transition was one of the original neoliberal architects, Milton Friedman, right? And so his classic statement is that what you need first is a crisis, right? That shows that things aren't working the way they are, and so there needs to be a change. And then what you need is a coherent kind of program for how to get out of that crisis that can move us forward, right? And that's exactly what neoliberalism did with the economic crisis of 1973, right? And so we see right now that we're still at the same kind of crisis moment again, right? And this is very much signaled by all the different examples that we gave at the beginning of the talk, right? So we see right now that we may be in that similar kind of moment where there's broader recognition now that what we've been doing up until now isn't really working, and there's a need for something quite different to make this happen, right? And so then there's a need for something to be able to come in and fill that gap. And so what we're hoping is that convivial conservation can contribute to that and help to provide that kind of blueprint for how to move forward that can help actually address the issues that we're facing right now in a productive and constructive way.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have one last question here. So I'm sure a lot of the comments also have mentioned this sounds like something that has been done already by different small groups, and it's interesting to see that many of these many different conservation projects here in the Philippines and likely elsewhere in the world, a lot of them sound like they would fit in with the concept of convivial conservation. For example, we've seen the emergence of indigenous and community conserved areas everywhere in the world, and how many local NGOs have been developing sustainable livelihoods for local communities where they are working in. Do you have any suggestions or any ideas on how we can synergize all of these different efforts already being done by different local NGOs, indigenous communities, and even some local government units here in the Philippines, and also to synergize this more broadly with efforts in our region, for example, in Southeast Asia, and then globally?
Yeah, I mean, if we had the answer to that question, I think we would all be a lot further than that, right? To synergize across these scales is an incredible challenge. And I don't think we necessarily see our role or the role for convivial conservation as a synergizing one. It's more to provide a broader picture that helps make sense the direction that we need to go into that others also are already doing, right? So it's more for us a matter not so much of synergizing, but connecting different struggles in such a way that they push for systemic change, right? Because, I mean, certain core principles are things that we need to agree on, right? So we think that the key core principles that we need to agree on are probably, right, that we need to move beyond economic growth, that we need to bring people and biodiversity together, right? And then we need to do so going forward towards the future in new ways. So these are core principles, but within that there's still a lot of space that works out very differently in the Philippines than it does here in South Africa, than it does in Europe. And also the last thing that we want to do is to say that, you know, two white guys from America and Europe need to decide this in some way for the Philippines. No, I mean, one of the core elements for us is also that conservation needs to decolonize, right? We feel that we have work to do, especially in the global north, right, to challenge the powerful conservation interests that are present in and come from the global north, to also allow space for different interests and voices, you know, from and in the global south, and then to connect them, right, to work together with you, with others, to challenge these interests, right? And so we also feel that we need to, at some point, also in that sense, step back. It can't be white guys from the north again. You know, it must be much more diverse and very different going forward from here.
Thank you. Rob, do you have anything to add before we end?
That sounds like a good kind of final statement, I think.
All right.
Wrap things up.
Thank you. I apologize to others in the audience who have other questions. I'm sure lots of you had more questions in mind, and it's apparent that this has been a very illuminating and engaging talk for everyone. So thank you again, Bram and Rob, for the wonderful discussion today. For all of us in the audience, everyone, we have lots of things to think about and take home from this talk, and find ways of maybe practicing this moving forward. I think everyone can grab a copy of the book, The Conservation Revolution, to read more about the proposal. It's on the website of Verso Books, its publisher, and I think I've seen it also in Amazon. And again, thank you, Bram and Rob, for the talk. And that brings us to the end of our day one session.